The foundations of a nation are being tested not on distant battlefields alone, but within the very fabric of its society and the corridors of its economic power. In Russia, what began as a swift military operation envisioned by the Kremlin has metastasized into a protracted and punishing conflict, a grinding war of attrition that is now reflecting back upon the country with profound and escalating force. The early expectations of a quick victory have dissolved, replaced by a sobering reality of economic siege, deepening international isolation, and a slow-burning domestic recalibration. While the state media projects an image of resilience and national unity, a complex and difficult picture is emerging from behind the curtain, one of a populace growing weary and an economy undergoing a fundamental, painful restructuring under the weight of unprecedented sanctions. The war in Ukraine, now entering its third year, has unleashed consequences that are systematically unraveling the economic and social compact that has defined Russia for decades. This is not merely a story of battlefield losses, though those are significant and continual. It is the story of a nation attempting to recalibrate its entire economic and geopolitical identity under fire, with its people bearing the mounting cost. The economic landscape of Russia has been transformed into a theater of conflict as consequential as the Donbass. The initial shock of sanctions in February 2022, the freezing of central bank assets, the expulsion from the SWIFT financial messaging system, the exodus of Western corporations was met with a semblance of stability. The Kremlin deployed capital controls, propped up the ruble with stringent monetary policy, and leveraged continued energy revenues to forestall immediate collapse. This created a deceptive calm. However, the true structural damage has been cumulative and corrosive. The departure of over 1,000 international companies, from manufacturers and logistics firms to consumer brands and service providers, has hollowed out entire sectors of the modern economy. It has led to supply chain fractures, technological stagnation, and a regression in product quality and variety. The parallel imports scheme orchestrated by the state channeling goods through third countries like Kazakhstan, Turkey, and Armenia has patched some holes, but at a sharply inflated cost and with chronic unpredictability. For the average Russian, this translates into a silently declining standard of living. Electronics, automobiles, pharmaceuticals, and everyday consumer goods have become significantly more expensive, harder to find, or inferior in quality. The loss of access to Western technology and financing is a slow-acting poison for industry, eroding long-term productive capacity. Perhaps the most dramatic strategic blow has been to Russia's energy empire, the very cornerstone of its economic and geopolitical power for the past quarter century. Europe, once the destination for over half of Russia's pipeline oil and gas, has executed a historic and unexpectedly rapid pivot. Through a combination of EU embargoes, a G7 price cap on seaborne Russian oil, and a relentless search for alternative suppliers, Russian energy revenues have been severely constrained. The Nord Stream pipeline explosions, shrouded in accusation and mystery, symbolize the irreversible severing of a major economic artery. While Russia has successfully redirected massive volumes of oil to India, China, and other friendly markets, it has done so at a steep discount, selling its prime resource at prices significantly below global benchmarks. The gas trade with Europe, once a multi-billion euro monthly revenue stream, has dwindled to a trickle. This represents a seismic loss of not just income, but of strategic leverage. The weaponization of gas supplies in 2022 backfired, accelerating Europe's decoupling and permanently diminishing Moscow's most potent instrument of influence over the continent. The energy infrastructure itself has come under attack, with Ukraine launching long-range drone strikes against refineries deep inside Russian territory. These attacks have damaged critical processing facilities, reducing fuel production for the domestic market and for the military, and exposing vulnerabilities far from the front lines. The social consequences within Russia are multifaceted and evolving. There is no mass. Visible protest, the formidable state security apparatus, and draconian wartime censorship laws have effectively suppressed overt political dissent. The label of foreign agent and the threat of long prison sentences for discrediting the armed forces have instilled a climate of fear and self-censorship. Yet, discontent manifests in subtler, more demographic ways. The initial mobilization drive in September 2022 triggered a historic exodus, with hundreds of thousands of predominantly young, educated, and skilled Russians fleeing to neighboring states to avoid the draft. This brain drain represents a catastrophic loss of human capital, the effects of which will cripple innovation and economic vitality for a generation. For those who remain, a pervasive sense of uncertainty and fatigue has set in. The relentless state propaganda narrative of a defensive war against a Nazi regime expanded by NATO cannot fully obscure the reality of mounting casualties, often felt in the closed grief of provincial towns and villages that supply a disproportionate number of soldiers. The social contract is being rewritten in real time. Acquiescence and outward patriotism are exchanged for stability, but the state's ability to deliver material prosperity, the bedrock of its legitimacy for 2 decades, is demonstrably eroding. Politically, the system has hardened into a rigid, monolithic stance. The conflict has been framed as an existential struggle for Russia's survival, leaving zero room for diplomatic off-ramps or public debate. Any political figure or influential voice advocating for negotiation from a position perceived as weakness is sidelined or silenced. The political landscape has been purified of meaningful opposition, consolidating power in an ever tighter circle around the presidency. This consolidation, however, comes with its own risks. It places the entirety of the state's fate and legitimacy on the ultimate outcome of the war. There can be no external scapegoats for domestic failures. The system has claimed absolute ownership of this project. Furthermore, the war has accelerated a profound ideological shift articulated in the concept of a civilizational state opposed to a decadent West. This is not merely rhetoric for external consumption. It is the new foundational ideology for domestic consumption, used to justify sacrifices and frame isolation as a virtuous path to sovereignty and traditional values. The political implication is a deepening trench between Russia and the liberal international order, a divide that appears generational in its scale. Internationally, Russia's isolation is not absolute, but is strategically profound. The global majority of non-Western states, including giants like China and India, have not signed on to the sanctions regime and continue to trade. This has provided Russia with a critical economic lifeline. However, this relationship is fundamentally asymmetrical. Russia has become a junior partner, a supplier of raw materials at discounted prices, and a buyer of manufactured goods from China. Its role as an independent great power is diminished, increasingly tethered to Beijing's strategic calculations. In its immediate neighborhood, the war has backfired catastrophically. Finland and Sweden, historically neutral, are now NATO members, extending the alliance's border with Russia by over 1,300 kilometers. Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia are pushing harder for EU integration. The purported goal of preventing NATO expansion has resulted in its dramatic acceleration and the galvanization of a united Western bloc more committed than at any point since the Cold War. The bridges to Europe are not merely damaged, they have been deliberately demolished from both sides, with reconstruction inconceivable under the current political paradigms. The global order is fracturing, but Russia finds itself in a bloc of one, reliant on the economic pragmatism of others rather than the binding trust of alliances. The military reality on the ground has become the central driver of all other consequences. A war initially planned as a rapid decapitation strike has degenerated into a brutal artillerized slog reminiscent of the bloodiest stalemates of the 20th century. The Russian military, having suffered devastating losses of its initial professional cadre, has reconstituted itself around a force of conscripts, mobilized reservists, and volunteers attracted by significant financial incentives. This army is larger but less trained, relying overwhelmingly on mass and expendable firepower to make incremental gains at horrific cost. The capture of symbolic strongholds like Bakhmut and Avdiivka came at a staggering price in men and materiel, deplaning Soviet-era stockpiles and forcing a frantic mobilization of the domestic defense industry. While Russia has regained the initiative on the front in 2024, it operates under severe constraints. The Ukrainian battlefield has become a graveyard for Russian armor, exposed to advanced Western-supplied artillery and drones. The war has exposed critical deficiencies in command, coordination, tactical intelligence, and infantry quality that no amount of sheer numbers has been able to fully overcome. This military quagmire directly fuels the domestic economic crisis. State spending is catastrophically skewed towards the war effort, with over 6% of GDP officially allocated to defense and security, a figure many analysts believe is a significant undercount. This represents a wholesale diversion of national resources from productive investment, infrastructure, maintenance, and social services, cannibalizing the future to feed the immediate demands of the front. On the home front, the Kremlin navigates a delicate balance between acknowledging the war's strains and maintaining a facade of normalcy and inevitable victory. Officially, the economy has stabilized and even grown, according to state statistics. This growth, however, is a macroeconomic illusion created by the immense stimulus of war production. Tanks, artillery shells, and munitions are counted as economic output, but they do not raise living standards or create sustainable post-war prosperity. This is a wartime economy firing on only one cylinder. Inflation remains persistently high, eroding savings and purchasing power. Critical imports, from manufacturing components to medical equipment, are fraught with logistical hurdles and corruption within the new parallel import schemes. Regional disparities have exploded. Moscow and St. Petersburg, with their concentrations of state and corporate wealth, are largely shielded from the harshest realities. In contrast, poorer ethnic republics and provincial towns bear a disproportionate share of the human toll, suffering higher casualty rates and receiving less economic compensation. This creates a latent powder keg of regional and social inequality masked by nationalist rhetoric but understood in homes across the Federation. The state's response has been to tighten control further. Internet censorship has advanced. Media remaining are entirely state-aligned, and historical narratives are aggressively reshaped in schools and public discourse to cement the war's necessity for generations to come. The international reaction has solidified into two opposing but evolving camps. The United States and the European Union have moved from initial shock to a posture of sustained containment. Their strategy is explicit: to degrade Russian military capabilities over the long term through continuous sanctions, and to financially and militarily sustain Ukraine for as long as it takes. This commitment, however, faces its own internal political headwinds and fatigue, a factor Moscow calculates into its strategic patience. The unity of the Western coalition, while still largely intact, shows fractures in the form of debates over escalation thresholds and the allocation of resources. Meanwhile, Russia's diplomatic outreach has focused on the so-called Global South, attempting to frame the conflict as a proxy war where NATO expansionism provoked a legitimate Russian response. This narrative finds a receptive audience in nations resentful of Western hegemony, but it has not translated into material support on the scale provided to Ukraine by the West. China remains the pivotal player, offering Russia a crucial economic lifeline and diplomatic cover while carefully avoiding direct military assistance that would trigger secondary sanctions. This relationship is one of convenience, not alliance. Beijing benefits from cheap Russian resources and a distracted West, but it is also cautious of the instability the war generates and has repeatedly expressed concern about nuclear rhetoric. For many other nations, from India to Saudi Arabia to Brazil, the war is a distant European conflict and an opportunity to practice strategic autonomy, extracting concessions from both sides while refusing to take a firm moral or political stand. Looking forward, the trajectories are set, but their endpoints remain dangerously unclear. The war has entered a phase of attrition where time is a weapon. Russia's strategy appears to be to outlast Western resolve, betting that political divisions in Washington and Brussels will eventually force Ukraine into an unfavorable negotiation. Economically, the nation is preparing for a long period of autarky and self-reliance, a shift towards a siege economy managed by a powerful, militarized state. This model, however, is inherently unstable, vulnerable to internal rot, elite avarice, and the simmering discontent of a population whose living standards are in slow but undeniable decline. Socially, a new generation is being shaped by isolation, patriotism, and grief, a combination that will define Russia's domestic psychology for decades. The possibility of a second wave of mobilization hangs perpetually in the air, a threat that could reignite domestic flight and dissent. Militarily, the summer of 2024 may see renewed offensive operations, but the likelihood of a strategic breakthrough that forces Ukrainian capitulation appears low, suggesting a protracted conflict measured in years, not months. Ultimately, the war has unleashed irreversible forces. Russia has burned its bridges to the West, perhaps for a generation, and has committed its identity and resources to a path with diminishing returns. The economic crisis is not a temporary shock, but a permanent recalibration towards a poorer, more isolated, and heavily militarized state. The people of Russia, while largely silenced, are navigating this new reality, a reality of lowered horizons, where the ambitions of a great power economy have been replaced by the daily calculations of resilience and survival. The world watches a nation of immense resources and historical weight attempting to defy gravity, to sustain an imperial war while its economic and diplomatic foundations are systematically dismantled. The outcome will determine not only the fate of Ukraine, but the character of Russia itself, a country slowly transforming under the immense, unrelenting pressure of a war it started but can no longer easily stop. The crisis is no longer at the gates. It is within the walls, reshaping institutions, lives, and the very future in a profound and enduring trial by fire.